Man punches 75-year-old gentleman. Keanu Reeves suddenly appears and changes everything. In a busy city square, a young man harasses and attacks an elderly gentleman, drawing the attention of onlookers. Just when the situation seems hopeless, Keanu Reeves appears out of nowhere. What begins as a heroic intervention unfolds into a life-changing act of kindness that not only helps the elderly man, but inspires an entire community. Don't miss this incredible story of courage, compassion, and transformation. Watch until the end to see how one moment of kindness can spark a movement. Like, comment, and subscribe for more inspiring stories that will stay with you. The bustling city square was alive with activity, filled with the usual sights and sounds of a busy afternoon. Tourists snapped pictures near a grand fountain, street performers entertained small crowds, and people hurried about their day. Among the commotion, a frail 75-year-old gentleman sat quietly on a bench, feeding crumbs to the pigeons gathered around him. The man, dressed in a modest coat and cap, exuded an air of quiet dignity. He seemed at peace, smiling faintly as he tossed a few more crumbs onto the ground. But his calm demeanor drew unwanted attention from a younger man standing nearby, a brash individual in his early 30s, wearing a leather jacket and an air of arrogance. The younger man muttered something under his breath, his eyes narrowing as he watched the older gentleman. No one noticed when he started walking toward the bench, his expression darkening with each step. Without warning, he barked, "Hey, old man, you think you can just sit there taking up space?" The elderly gentleman looked up, startled. "I'm sorry, young man," he said softly, his voice calm. "I didn't mean to bother anyone." The younger man scoffed, his tone dripping with disdain. "You people are always in the way," he spat. "Maybe you should move before someone makes you." The commotion began to draw attention, with a few passers-by slowing their steps to observe. The older man tried to defuse the situation. "I'll leave if it's a problem," he said, starting to rise from the bench. But the younger man wasn't done. "Too late for that," he sneered, and before anyone could react, he shoved the older gentleman back onto the bench. Gasps echoed through the square, but the attacker wasn't finished. He raised his fist, anger flashing in his eyes. Then, seemingly out of nowhere, a voice rang out. "Hey, that's enough!" The younger man froze mid-swing, turning to see where the voice had come from. Standing just a few feet away was none other than Keanu Reeves. His presence was commanding, his sharp features set in a calm, yet unmistakably firm expression. Dressed in a black jacket and jeans, Keanu looked every bit the action hero he was known for on screen, but there was no performance in the intensity of his gaze. The square fell silent, all eyes now on the unexpected newcomer. "Step away from him," Keanu said, his voice low but filled with authority. "Now!" The younger man hesitated, his confidence visibly shaken. The air seemed to thicken as Keanu took a step closer, his calm demeanor carrying more weight than any shouted threat. The tension in the square was palpable, and the crowd, which had grown larger, watched with bated breath. What happened next would not only change the course of the altercation, but leave everyone present stunned by Keanu's unexpected actions. The younger man hesitated, his bravado faltering as Keanu's steady gaze pinned him in place. For a moment, the square seemed frozen in time, the crowd holding its collective breath. Then, with a defiant sneer, the man turned toward Keanu. "Who do you think you are?" he spat, his voice shaking slightly despite his attempt at confidence. "Stay out of this, Hollywood." Keanu didn't flinch. His expression remained calm, but there was an unmistakable edge to his tone as he replied, "I'm someone who won't stand by while you pick on an old man. So I'll say it again. Step away." The crowd murmured, a mix of curiosity and awe rippling through the onlookers. The younger man clenched his fists, his frustration boiling over. "You think you can just walk in here and play the hero?" he barked, taking a step closer to Keanu. "What are you going to do? Call security?" Keanu took another step forward, closing the gap between them. He wasn't towering, but his presence was overwhelming, his calm demeanor a stark contrast to the younger man's aggression. "This isn't a movie," Keanu said, his voice steady but sharp. "You've got two choices. Walk away now, or deal with the consequences." The younger man glanced around, realizing the crowd was no longer just watching. They were on Keanu's side. Whispers of admiration for the actor began to fill the square. The man's confidence wavered, but his pride wouldn't let him back down so easily. "You think you scare me?" he challenged, trying to puff himself up. "You're just some washed-up actor." Keanu tilted his head slightly, his lips curving into a faint, almost amused smile. "Washed up or not," he said, his tone laced with calm authority. "You don't want to find out what happens next." The younger man faltered, his resolve cracking as Keanu's words hung in the air. But before he could respond, the elderly gentleman, who had been quietly watching the exchange, spoke up. "Please," the old man said, his voice gentle but firm. "This doesn't need to escalate. Let's all just walk away." Keanu turned slightly, his expression softening as he addressed the older man. "I've got this," he said, his tone reassuring. "You don't have to worry." The younger man took advantage of the momentary distraction, lunging forward in a last-ditch attempt to intimidate Keanu. But before he could get close, Keanu sidestepped smoothly, his movements precise and effortless. With a quick, controlled motion, he deflected the man's swing, causing him to stumble and fall to the ground. The crowd gasped, their admiration turning into outright applause as Keanu stood tall, offering the man a chance to collect himself. "That's enough," Keanu said firmly, his calm voice cutting through the noise. "It's over." The younger man scrambled to his feet, his face flushed with humiliation. He looked around at the crowd, now cheering for Keanu, and realized there was no recovering his pride. Without another word, he turned and stormed off, disappearing into the crowd. Keanu exhaled slowly, the tension in his posture easing as he turned back to the elderly man. "Are you all right, sir?" he asked, his voice gentle. The old man nodded, his eyes filled with gratitude. "Thanks to you," he said. "I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't stepped in." Keanu gave a small smile, helping the man to his feet. "No one deserves to be treated like that," he said simply. The crowd began to disperse, though many lingered, taking photos and whispering excitedly about what they just witnessed. But as Keanu helped the elderly man back to the bench, it became clear that the story wasn't over yet. What Keanu did next would leave everyone even more amazed. The elderly gentleman, still shaken but grateful, settled back onto the bench with Keanu by his side. The crowd had begun to thin out, though a few onlookers lingered, their phones discreetly aimed at the actor. Keanu, unfazed by the attention, focused entirely on the old man. "What's your name, sir?" Keanu asked, his voice warm but concerned. "Walter," the gentleman replied, his voice soft. "Walter Hayes." Keanu nodded. "Walter, you sure you're okay? That guy didn't hurt you, did he?" Walter shook his head, managing a faint smile. No, I'm fine. Just a little rattled, that's all. I've dealt with worse." Keanu's brow furrowed slightly. "Worse?" he repeated, his tone laced with curiosity and concern. Walter hesitated, his gaze dropping to the ground. "It's just, the world isn't kind to people who've gotten old," he said quietly. "People like me, we get ignored, dismissed, or worse, like today. It's not the first time someone's treated me like I don't matter." Keanu's jaw tightened subtly, his calm demeanor now tinged with quiet resolve. "That's not right," he said simply. "You deserve better than that, Walter. Everyone does." Walter chuckled softly, though there was no humor in it. "That's kind of you to say, son, but not everyone thinks like you." Keanu leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees as he looked Walter in the eye. "Maybe not," he said, "but that doesn't mean we can't start changing things." Walter glanced at him, intrigued. "What do you mean?" Keanu smiled faintly, the wheels in his mind already turning. "You'll see," he said. "But first, let me ask, do you live around here?" Walter nodded. "A few blocks away. Been here my whole life. Used to be a neighborhood filled with families and small businesses. Now, well, you've seen it. It's different." Keanu sat back, his expression thoughtful. "You've seen a lot, haven't you?" he said. Walter shrugged. "I suppose I have." Keanu looked around the square, his gaze lingering on the fountain and the bustling streets. "Walter, how about I give you a ride home?" he said after a moment. "And on the way, you can tell me more about this neighborhood. I've got a feeling you've got some stories worth hearing." Walter blinked, surprised by the offer. "You'd do that? After all this?" Keanu chuckled softly. "Of course," he said. What's the point of helping someone if you don't finish the job? The sincerity in Keanu's words brought a small smile to Walter's face. All right, he said, if you insist. Keanu stood and offered Walter his arm, helping him up from the bench. I do, he said with a grin. As they began walking toward the edge of the square, a few of the lingering onlookers clapped softly, their admiration for Keanu growing even stronger. But for Keanu, it wasn't about the applause. He knew there was more to Walter's story, and what he was about to do would prove that kindness isn't just a moment, it's a choice. Keanu guided Walter to the curb, where a sleek black SUV waited, its driver stepping out as they approached. We'll take you home, Walter, Keanu said with a reassuring smile, opening the door for him. Walter hesitated briefly, overwhelmed by the unexpected kindness, but finally climbed in. As they drove through the streets, Walter relaxed, the tension from earlier fading. The soft hum of the car allowed for conversation, and Keanu encouraged him to talk about the neighborhood. This place used to be so full of life, Walter began, his voice steady but tinged with nostalgia. Families everywhere, kids playing in the park, small businesses on every corner. Now most of them are gone, replaced by high-rises and big corporations. It's like the soul of the place just disappeared. Keanu listened intently, his expression thoughtful. What about you, Walter? You said you've been here your whole life. What kept you rooted? Walter chuckled softly, his gaze fixed out the window. My late wife, Margaret, he said. We built our lives here. She was a teacher at the local school, always said this neighborhood was worth fighting for. Even after she passed, I couldn't bring myself to leave. It's all I have left of her. Keanu nodded, his respect for Walter growing with every word. Sounds like Margaret was an amazing woman, he said, and you've honored her by staying. Walter's smile faltered slightly. I've tried, he said, but it's hard when the world around you keeps changing and you feel like you don't fit anymore. Keanu leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. Walter, people like you are the backbone of places like this, he said. You've seen its history, lived its stories. That's not something that should be forgotten or pushed aside. Walter looked at Keanu, surprised by the depth of his words. You really believe that? He asked. Keanu smiled faintly. I do, and I think others will too, if they get the chance to hear your story. The SUV slowed to a stop outside a modest apartment building. Walter turned to Keanu. Gratitude etched across his face. Thank you for listening, he said quietly. Not many people would. Keanu shook his head. Thank you for sharing, he replied. But this isn't the end, Walter. I've got an idea. Walter tilted his head, curious. An idea? Keanu's smile widened. Just wait, he said. You'll see. Walter climbed out of the car, and as Keanu helped him to his door, the actor's mind was already racing. He had seen enough to know that Walter's story and his neighborhood deserved more than to be forgotten. And with Keanu's connections, he knew exactly how to make sure they wouldn't be. A week had passed since the incident in the square, and Walter had returned to his routine, feeding the pigeons at the park, taking slow walks through his neighborhood, and quietly reminiscing about the past. He hadn't expected to hear from Keanu again. People like him didn't keep in touch with people like Walter, or so he thought. But one sunny afternoon, as Walter sat on his usual bench, the sound of commotion broke through his thoughts. He looked up to see a crowd gathering near the square, cameras flashing and voices buzzing with excitement. Curious, he shuffled toward the crowd, his heart skipping a beat when he saw Keanu standing at the center, surrounded by reporters and local officials. Keanu spotted Walter immediately and waved him over. Walter, he called, his grin wide and genuine. The crowd parted as Walter made his way forward, his confusion evident. What's all this? Walter asked, his voice shaky. Keanu placed a hand on his shoulder, his eyes filled with warmth. I told you I had an idea, he said. This is it. Gesturing to the crowd, Keanu began to explain. I reached out to some people I know, city officials, local businesses, and even some old friends. We're starting a revitalization project for this neighborhood. It's going to bring back the small businesses, create community spaces, and honor the history of this place. Walter blinked, stunned. You? You're doing this for the neighborhood? Keanu smiled. For the neighborhood and for people like you. Your story, your history, it inspired this. And I want to make sure it's not forgotten. Walter's eyes glistened with tears, his voice trembling as he spoke. I don't know what to say. This is incredible. Keanu chuckled softly. You don't have to say anything, Walter. Just know that this place matters because of people like you. The crowd erupted into applause, the energy in the square electric with hope and excitement. Keanu turned to the reporters, addressing them with his signature humility. This isn't about me, he said firmly. This is about people like Walter, who've lived here, loved here, and kept this place alive. It's time we give back. As the crowd cheered, Walter looked around, overwhelmed by the moment. He had spent years feeling invisible, but now his story had sparked a change he never imagined possible. Keanu leaned in close, his voice soft. Margaret would be proud, he said. Walter smiled through his tears, nodding. She would, he whispered. Thank you, Keanu, for everything. Keanu gave him a small, respectful nod before turning back to the crowd, shaking hands and sharing his vision. Walter stayed for a while, soaking in the atmosphere, his heart lighter than it had been in years. As the day wound down and the crowd began to disperse, Walter returned to his bench. The square felt different now, not just because of the project, but because, for the first time in a long while, it felt alive again. And as he watched the pigeons flutter around his feet, he smiled, knowing that one act of kindness had not only changed his life, but the life of his entire community. If this story inspired you, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more powerful and heartwarming tales. Stay tuned for the next story that reminds us all of the incredible impact of kindness and humanity.